Welcome back to Plugged In.
I'm Phil Lombard,
And I'm Yinka Ogundi.
and we'll be your hosts for today.
Today we have Fiona Martin. Fiona is the Regional Director for Community and Social Performance in Australia. She has 20 years of strategic community and social performance experience across the industry lifecycle, complemented by roles in government in Australia and international consulting. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you.
We also have with us Christine Foster. Christine is the Manager of Community Engagement and Social Performance in our Calgary office. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you.
So to get things started, maybe just to set the stage on the importance of consultation for all projects. Why do projects need consultations with local stakeholders?
I think it's really important to first really set the scene on what we're seeing in the growth across mining and metals, because that really highlights the critical importance, which Christine will really expand on. So what we're seeing is with the transition to renewables and in such areas as battery production, there's a huge increase in the demand for minerals in copper, lithium, graphite, cobalt and nickel. And what we're seeing is the intersection with particularly Indigenous peoples and peasants' land is quite significant. There's around 69% of energy transition projects are on or near land that qualifies as Indigenous, which brings up a whole host of issues, but also the importance of community and stakeholder engagement, free, prior and informed consent, and building genuine partnerships and community trust.
Yeah, absolutely, Fiona. And I would add to that from the general context that all projects need consultation to ensure that communities and stakeholders are not only brought along in their understanding of the development. This may be new for some communities. It's very technical. I'm sure a lot of folks listening who are engineers can appreciate the complexity of some of these projects. And so bringing them along in that understanding, but also then bringing them along to understand how they can meaningfully contribute and benefit to and from these projects as well. It's these sustainable relationships that are created through these consultations that really bring success both to the community in terms of sustainable socioeconomic development in the long term, but also to the projects themselves. So consultation really feeds that. Here in the Canadian context, to be frank, that's more where I'm familiar. We do have the constitutionally enshrined duty to consult our Indigenous peoples here in Canada, and all land across Canada has different legal classifications for what that consultation looks like. So it's very important for proponents to put in the work to understand that historic and legal context to the land that your project may be on. Reserve land, that's normally what people think of as Indigenous land in Canada. It's actually only 2% of the land in Canada, but the rest of the land may be unceded territory, traditional territory. The land may have new and current land claims. And so all of these different classifications are important to understand because they will have significant impact on the type of consultation, types of relationships and engagements that proponents should undertake. So really all projects within Canada need to consider this.
And in Australia too, we have Indigenous land use agreements, consultation on cultural heritage, and particularly critical cultural heritage and culturally and very significant cultural heritage within that. But when you look more broadly internationally, it's really important with Indigenous people and with communities more broadly to consult on a whole host of areas, because you're going into lands that often may have water insecurity issues, food insecurity issues, where projects can require access to a significant tracts of land for development, not only for the mining development, but for their infrastructure corridors, non-processing infrastructure, tailings, dams, a whole host of areas as well. So it's very important to get that consultation right at the beginning, and it is very much an expectation of communities, and it's an expectation of financiers, lenders, investors when you look from an ESG perspective, and projects and companies also have commitments in their global standards and in the way they do business and also in their project toll gates, as well as the broader government regulatory context. And certainly in Australia, it's similar to Canada. It's enshrined within project approvals and legislation, and you need to demonstrate that you have engaged appropriately with not only in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but with communities as well.
Thank you, Fiona, Christine, for those wonderful insights. And just taking that a step further with the Inflation Reduction Act and the need to develop resources here in North America for the battery material space, how important would you say consultation with local stakeholders is? Give us an example of a stakeholder engagement that was done poorly and a stakeholder engagement that was done well.
I think from the North American context, or more specifically the Canadian context, we're really lucky to have some great examples of that. Outside of the EV battery industry, we have BHP Jansen, which Hatch is supporting that project. And it's really a fantastic example within the Indigenous participation, specifically with respect to employment, contracts, and procurement in Canada, and specifically in Saskatchewan. It's going beyond the requirements of consultation and agreements and looking at that long-term relationship, both with opportunity agreement nations and others. We've also seen some interesting engagements with the Goliath Gold project, which actually involved the local Indigenous community in order to incorporate traditional knowledge into the mitigation measures and overall approach with the impact assessment, which is something that's being picked up in other projects, specifically in Quebec with the EV battery industry. We have a client in the Bécancour region in Quebec that has taken on a voluntary impact assessment, and they are working in close collaboration with the First Nation there, both subcontracting for parts of the impact assessment itself, as well as co-creating some of the content for the report and mitigation measures and so on. So looking at starting that relationship early in order to make sure that it's seen more as a partnership going forward rather than reacting after the fact.
I think it's really important for that question to really unpack what we mean by consultation. Like often during the project approvals phase, companies typically and historically have tended to focus on consultation, telling people what the project will involve, and then reflecting some of their feedback within the project design. But it's often far too late at that phase, project approvals, to really have community influencing the project design. So what we're seeing increasingly is companies expecting, when they put out packages of work for their feasibility study work, right back at the feasibility phase 1 stage, then into phase 2 and then phase 3. And what you find is phase 1 is where you're putting all the options on the table, you hone it down in phase 2, and then you get into the details in phase 3, and that's really where the project approvals phase comes in. So they're actually enshrining in their own kind of toll gating procedure the requirement to do that earlier consultation and engagement. But what we're seeing is it's not only just the consultation about telling, it's also engaging with communities about the benefits of the project and the design and alternative designs. So as an example, we're working on a project proposal at the moment. A client's looking at a project, a new mine development within Asia. It's going to have a lot of components to it, including tailings facility, energy, process engineering requirements, and non-processing infrastructure, port. But within that actual proposal, what we've got as an example is for energy, they're looking at taking from a whole host of different options and then honing it down to, let's say, about 5, and then working with communities, organisations to look at how could that energy mix also really benefit and involve the community. And it's all part of us putting a social value lens over the way that these mining companies are doing business. So that's an example of where there's an evolution as well. I've seen bad examples, and this has really been historically, let's say a decade plus ago, where during that project approvals phase, the company's been consulting with communities on one thing around workforce. but then they've not actually shared what their real plans are around the workforce and local workforce content, which has really come to bite them when they've got the project approvals in place, and then the community just finds out what the local workforce needs are, because it wasn't actually put in legislation that you had to consider local content. So then what happens is government then takes that on board, they consult with communities, and you find that these things become more prescriptive in legislation and requirements around local content and things, which is a good thing to have, right? But companies often they can bring forward these regulatory kind of requirements and prescriptive requirements by virtue of some of their activities in the past. But we're seeing in the main genuine intent, certainly from the top tier companies, but in the rush to expedite some of the projects, it can also still be problematic for the industry as a whole.
Awesome. Thanks for those fantastic insights. And just kind of piggybacking on that last thought there, Fiona, and honing in on the battery metals space, we're seeing a lot of these projects that are pressured with the task of prioritizing speed to market. How are you seeing this newfound emphasis on project execution speed impacting how companies are approaching stakeholder engagement? And how can we be pragmatic about addressing clients' needs while still making sure stakeholder voices are heard and integrated?
Yeah, so we do a lot of due diligence within Hatch, and that's working for lenders, investors, but then also for companies who might be wanting to go upstream and invest in the supply chain. And certainly in the battery area is an example of where you've got minerals that's occurring, whether it be lithium and others. So there's an example recently of a due diligence we were doing on a rare earth metals project, and basically what we're finding is explorers are small capitalisation explorer companies are coming into the market. They're identifying these resources, they're then listing on the stock exchange, they're then going forward for project approvals, and it can be a very expedited process because there's a market opportunity that they need to meet. So a small cap can go to, say, a $2 billion project in a very small time, within, say, 18 months. And then they're putting in all their kind of project approvals and making commitments. Often these companies can have a connection to the local level and they're very committed to doing the right thing and engaging, but it's just their understanding of ESG and processes and engagement which can catch them out. But they do, I'm seeing still overall genuine intent. So we had an example of a project that had ramped up to $2 billion market capitalisation. They'd got their agreements in place, made all these commitments around social management systems, environmental management systems. We're actually into the construction phase, but didn't actually have any of these set up. And all these offtake agreements had been signed with organisations that were operating in a region where there's real kind of modern slavery and human rights risks. We had a top 250 global company come in, and they have all of these commitments. They have a really quite a significant social activism profile against them as well. And we found that they wanted us to look in a lot more detail than, say, a traditional environmental and social governance assessment would be. So not only committed to all the international standards and requirements, human rights impacts assessments, but to really look at that responsible sourcing in the supply chain. And the stakeholder and community engagement side, they were very interested and wanted us to look in detail at the engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Was there free, prior and informed consent? Was there the appropriate cultural heritage agreements and requirements in place for that specific jurisdiction? So a lot more emphasis put on it, and I really genuinely felt as though social in that example had an equal seat at the table, because we were looking at finance risk, we were looking at the design, construction, and we could reflect the cost of some of those social risks within the actual recommendations back to the client who was looking at this project as an offtake or a potential acquisition target.
That's really interesting, Fiona. I feel like I'm learning a lot right now as well. I love it. I would jump in with a little bit from the Canadian context. So we're seeing here one of the pressure points for timing and speed to market is the fact that this is a government-sponsored industry. There's, from the federal and provincial levels, a lot of funding, a lot of draft regulations and other things coming out from these bodies in order to move the industry forward. For example, in Quebec, the government just recently published new draft regulations to chart a course to 100% of new car sales to be EV by 2035. That's pretty fast considering the entire life cycle. But the province also came out with battery development strategy basically for that entire life cycle, from mining all the way to recycling of the materials for EV batteries. And so you're seeing a lot of pressure from government. But interestingly, if you take a step back and come back to our topic of engagement, these expectations for engagement and consultation are also set by those regulators and government bodies. And so what we're actually seeing from proponents is that they're answering the call to action, for example, in Quebec, to help the province become a global leader in the EV battery industry, but they're also hearing the importance of meaningful and early and often engagement with First Nations to make that happen. And so we're actually seeing that proponents are more and more seeing that the precedent is set, that it's no longer enough to check the box of consultation, that early and iterative, meaningful engagement can actually address what communities' values, interests, and concerns are upfront. So you actually get to mitigate project risk before you start, and you're able to speed up things that way. So from some clients that we've spoken with, they've actually seen the consultation not as a time delay, but a time saver. If you start on that foot, it's easier to start with that than to have to backtrack, but we are seeing that quite a bit with our clients.
And I would have to say, Christine, that in an Australian context, we're seeing the same thing, right? You're in an economy, it's a developed economy where there's a good regulatory basis for development, good governance, etc. And so you're getting this regulatory imperative, but you've also got the systems to support and demonstrate, like free, prior, informed consent and other processes. So they're relatively mature, whereas when you're looking at a whole host of developing economies, those things just aren't yet, they haven't caught up, they're not in place. Like an example would be the lithium triangle, which includes Bolivia, Chile, and northeast Argentina as an example. You know, lithium exploration and production has increased in Argentina alone, apparently by about 928% during a 3-year period. So it's quite significant growth, and there's not necessarily the system set up around community consultation requirements that you have in other areas. So coming back to what I said earlier is then governments start to come in and look at the regulatory environment, and sometimes that can then escalate political risk and resource nationalism risks as well, because they're trying to get control of this conflict-prone situation and improve things, but sometimes it can, it can go too far the other way. But we are seeing right across the scale for minerals, not only in, the battery supply chain, but more broadly when you're talking about the energy transition and in areas like copper and others, that there's just this huge expedited growth expectation and profile to meet the demand for critical minerals.
Thank you so much for your insights, Fiona, Christine. I think you've pretty much touched on just how important it is for Indigenous communities to be consulted on these projects before they move ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you to our listeners. Please like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.